speaking to us about access to digital resources and how it remains uneven on the continent and the implications of this, but also the investment that African leaders must make in the technology, in the access, in the infrastructure, and also into the literacy about it, is none other than CEO of Telkom Consumer and Small Business, Lunga Siyo. Lunga, welcome.
Hi, good afternoon. How you guys doing?
Doing very well, doing even better now that you're here.
Cool. Thank you very much. I hope I could be helpful. I heard earlier on that most of the audiences are actually people that run businesses, entrepreneurs, which is something that's also close to my heart as well, right? And it's actually linked to why I actually ended up working for this organization as and really our hopes and ambitions is to seamlessly connect South Africans, right? And we don't just say that, we actually mean it. And maybe just before I speak, right, bridging the digital divide to me is close because I've seen what technology and the power of connectivity could potentially do to people that are much more less fortunate than we are. Now, imagine a youngster, right, who grows up in a rural village, smack bang somewhere in the middle of the country, that actually has access to the internet via a smartphone, right? And it doesn't have to be an expensive smartphone. It could be a smartphone that could render applications such as TikTok, Facebook, right? And that youngster who lives in a less fortunate area with less resources and all of a sudden has access to TikTok, as an example, right? Or any of these social media platforms that renders videos. And their imagination completely changes because they can easily teleport themselves into a street in New York, London, Abuja in Nigeria, or somewhere in India or China or Australia, and see a life that's completely different from theirs. It actually changes, right? It changes their mindset. It actually allows them to dream differently in terms of their own opportunities and options, because sometimes we get trapped in less fortunate positions, which also limits our own thinking and also imagination as well. And therefore, what you usually aim for is just to get to the next meal when you could potentially see the world differently. And that's what the power of the internet has, right? Now, imagine the same person who's been able to imagine this world differently because now they have access to the internet via their own phones, and it could be a computer. They potentially see careers that they've never thought of, such as coding or building a website. And therefore, beyond just matric, instead of going to varsity, they actually use the internet, channels such as YouTube or even social media, to learn how to code and to learn how to build a website. And they start offering these services to local entrepreneurs or even businesses in where they live, and they start building them. And it starts as a new skill that they've acquired, but now they're starting a business. And the same person doesn't really have to take a bus or a taxi or a plane to Johannesburg to find a job. Could actually potentially use other professional business applications to market their businesses. And therefore, someone like me who's sitting somewhere in Johannesburg looking for small businesses that will create micro websites for my own SMEs that are buying those products from me, I don't have to do it myself. I can actually contract these people that are working from anywhere, including this youngster in the rural area, to actually create websites on behalf of my own SMEs. And you would have created now a small business in that particular area that actually creates income for themselves, for their own businesses, and for their own families. And therefore, bridging the digital divide, colleagues, today is very important for all of us because economically, it could improve a lot of lives and a lot of people. Now, it's not just about access, right? It's not a luxury, it's a lifeline. And that's why I started with those two use cases or even stories of what this could potentially do. Because when we look at it, we think it's something completely different from what it could potentially do for people that are in less fortunate positions, where you create a flywheel effect of them getting out of those areas, right, into becoming economically participants or citizens that could potentially economically contribute, right, to the economy of this South Africa by just running a small business. And I've seen this in many instances where at some point we're offshoring a lot of what I call Java developers, right, from India. And most of these guys that I've met virtually, and in some instances I've visited them, they're working from rural areas. All they have is a computer, access to the internet because they've got data, and they've got a generator to actually power for electricity. And they're offering their skills to the world and getting paid for it without leaving their homes. And that's what it could do to these people. Now, if I'm just looking at mobile internet penetration in sub-Saharan Africa, it's about 27%. It's projected to grow to 37%, but it actually means still a lot more people, right, don't have access to it. And this reality, right, is actually not stopping up until we do something about it. In many cases, right, people who don't have access to the internet, it actually impacts the quality of their own lives, right? It impacts the quality of their education, the jobs that they could potentially find, and it even limits their career trajectory, like I was saying earlier on as well. And it actually goes beyond just that as well. It just impacts how people live and how they can potentially develop as a people as well. Now, if I look at where most people actually have internet access, it's largely in urban areas. So therefore, we actually have to talk about rural areas as well and how we can actually bridge that divide as well. Now, what we've also seen as well is that there's also a little bit of a gender, right, divide, where you only find about 42% of males, right, have access to the internet and only 32% of females. This is sub-Saharan Africa, it's not South Africa. The stats in South Africa could be a bit different and a bit higher. However, we still have a large population of people in rural areas who don't have access to the internet for a variety of reasons, right? And we'll see, right, how we can potentially impact these people and really stop the perpetuation of this inequality as well, because digitally we could actually change that and leapfrog the world without really building a large manufacturing muscle, right? Kind of like that, the African Union as well has made it as a priority. And as we've heard from the previous speaker as well, is that it is a priority, but the African Union is not well coordinated as we could want it to be. So therefore, private companies have to play a role as well in actually ensuring that we can meet some of these ambitions, right? Now, this can really improve a lot of things, right, in so many ways. The quality of education itself as well, how it's delivered, and how kids at school could learn things outside of their own curriculum, how they could actually, engage with the world, via many different platforms because they actually have access, to the internet as well. It could lead into decent work, and it could really, really create what we call inclusive growth, right? Because there is growth that you can get, but if it's not inclusive and pulling those people that are really less fortunate into the mainstream of the economy, it really is not filtering through to the less fortunate, which is what we want here to happen. And I think it's the biggest opportunity that we have in the continent. Now, I was doing some other study on the potential of data centers in the continent. And what I came up with was one of the emerging economies, which is Brazil, which is similar to what you find in South Africa, has more broadband capacity than the entire continent. More broadband capacity than the entire continent. Now, to connect to the world, you literally need these subsea cables that are connecting into Africa, and I think we're sitting with possibly about 8 or 9 across the continent, from West Africa all the way to Southern and East Africa. Once those cables are terminated in country, we then have to carry them in our own infrastructure in country to literally just create the traffic for internet. And in most instances, the applications that we do run are actually getting terminated or are hosted in data centers outside of the continent. And there's a huge opportunity of creating a lot more data centers and creating a lot more broadband capacity that really improves latency and speeds. However, once you do that, it creates economic activity that will actually lead into better economies and improve profitability for those that are actually investing in it, therefore drive the price of data to become much lower and therefore get a lot more people included into these economies that are becoming much more digital in nature. Now, we actually have what I call, a population dividend in Africa. I mean, we were projected to actually grow our population, right, to about 2.5 billion by 2025. So in essence, you could potentially have 1 out of 4 people in the world living in this continent. And it's a young population that we see. And all we have to do is to ensure that we impart the skills and knowledge and actually train them to gather and actually earn skills that will take us into the future so that they can participate in this world that is becoming much more digital and driven by technology as well. It won't happen if we don't do anything about it. And I think from a youth population perspective, we're trending in the right direction, but we really have to make sure that the youth is well developed and given the skills that we'll need for future as well. There's a lot more that we can do in this space as well. Now, there's one thing to actually build a connectivity infrastructure across the continent. To run things such as e-commerce, as an example, you need a proper working road, rail, and air infrastructure, especially if you are a business that's selling products that you have to deliver. Very important that we partner with governments to ensure that the investment in infrastructure continuously happens, not just in South Africa, but in the continent as well. Because beyond South Africa, there's possibly close to 900 million people that we could potentially see as part of a community that we can do business with and potentially create companies out of Africa as well. But the infrastructure has to be there as well. And we do know that the African Continental Free Trade Agreement was signed, which is also a step in the right direction that could potentially unlock, this value that's sitting in the continent as well. It also plays into this Pan-African vision that everyone is pushing, really, where we actually are looking at how do we actually enable small business and entrepreneurs in rural areas, urban areas, to really start creating e-commerce type of businesses, because with e-commerce, you're not only trading in your territory, in the people that are physically passing your store or what you've created. You actually have a market that lives on the internet that you can trade with. That is also cross-border as well. There's nothing stopping us having small businesses producing things in Johannesburg and selling to a market in Swaziland, as an example, or even Botswana, or even Congo, or someone who might have a particular product in Congo that is actually in demand in South Africa. Instead of you getting into a plane to go and actually buy it there, you can buy these things over the internet. However, we have to start really getting into a space where we foster this cross-border e-commerce and trade, and it has to be facilitated by governments and looking at regulation as well. But every country has to play a role in creating the infrastructure, the air infrastructure to move the goods and services, the rail infrastructure to move those goods and services. However, the services business where you don't have to move anything, where you just impart services. So think about a specialist doctor that is only trading in a particular area in Johannesburg. And with their free time, they could potentially consult to people in rural areas, right, via virtual platforms. And those people in rural areas, they actually have to have access to the internet. So therefore, by creating the infrastructure there, you're not just actually improving their lives, but you also give them access to specialist doctors that they would not necessarily see in their own areas, and you're doing this virtually as well. And those services could actually potentially happen cross-border, not just in South Africa or within the borders of South Africa. They can happen cross-border because it's a services business that can deliver over the internet. And it's just one of those examples. Now, coming back close home to what we're doing as Telkom, as the group, we literally have an infrastructure company called OpenServe. which now holds the chairmanship position within the South African Telecommunications Association, which is an association that is made up of all the telcos in the SADC region, in essence. And we're trying to foster a collaboration to see how we can literally create a borderless fiber network across all those countries and connect all 14 SADC countries. How do we actually ensure that we have a tier 4 data center in the region where we literally terminate most of the traffic that's being run by the large applications? So think about a TikTok as an example. Most of their data is not terminated yet, and it's actually hosted in data centers. So it's terminated here, but it's hosted in data centers outside of the continent. How do we get such companies to start hosting some of their local data with all the TikTok users in Africa as an example, where it's hosted here? And you can do this with Facebook, which has been playing a really active role in ensuring that they can host local data, those local currents, which also talks to data sovereignty in essence. So we actually have control of our own data as well and the security around it as well. And that's what we're trying to do within this SATA forum. We also part of the B20 at the back of G20 as well, where we're really active participants in how potentially our country and also the continent could also bridge this digital divide through public and private partnerships as well. We've been rolling out fiber in what we call peri-urban areas, because in most urban areas in South Africa, you'll find fiber. It's still active. A lot of companies rolling out fiber. We've really been at the forefront of providing affordable mobile broadband. What we mean by that is the value propositions we've created for mobile data have really changed how South Africans, consume data, and it actually allows them to consume a lot more at really affordable prices. That was also part of really recreating, new price points so that the people really in those less fortunate areas could potentially afford to buy a gig of data, because it actually means a lot to them. Where instead of paying in excess of $120, you could pay in excess of just around $30, right? For a gig of data for a particular application, right? There's many propositions that we've done to ensure that we can include a lot more people into this. We've built almost close to 130 kilometers of fiber. It's very important that you actually move your traffic via fiber into base stations, and then you can use mobility products to connect people. And we've been connecting a lot of that, and we'll continue to do this. And we're doing it as a private company. Not that other companies are not doing it as well, but we've also, via the B20 and also some other engagements in the country, been pushing for a public-private partnerships, because with commercial entities, there's a limitation where you can build infrastructure, because if you cannot commercialize it, it becomes difficult to have that business case being approved by funders and or your own board as well. Whereas what we've learned in other countries in Europe, Australia, India, and China as well, including Brazil as well, is that government has played an active role in actually creating an infrastructure company that's actually funded by government to actually subsidize the rollout of infrastructure into rural areas. And it is actually operated by private companies, though backed by government, because private companies become much more efficient. They've been doing it for years. It's part of their own business. So therefore, they can do this much more efficiently, but it's backed by government. And therefore, the price within which those people in those areas could consume a gig of data becomes much cheaper. And in some instances, depending on what they want to do with the data that they've bought, it could be zero rated as well for certain platforms, including government services and also access to libraries and content and information. It's only when you actually have to access a video then those customers would potentially pay. And these are some of the use cases we've seen in other developing nations where potentially we could do this as a country as well. And that's what we've been pushing for as well as an organization. We drive digital literacy through our own foundation as well, because I'm a huge proponent of coding skills and all the new skills that are coming up, because you don't need a degree or a diploma for it. And in many instances, you just need a very engaged and deep course over a 3 weeks period to actually learn the skill and be able to pick it up, but you actually have to be, doing something to actually build that capability yourself. So we're driving a lot of those digital literacy skills. The stuff that we're doing with eSIMs, South Africa is not yet there, but it will get into a point where we don't really need the plastic SIM cards, and every phone will be enabled. With government's push towards migrating out of 3G into 4G, what it actually means is that we need phones that would actually work on 4G, which is smartphones. The government has come to the party by removing the duty on all smartphones up to about 2,500, which is going to help the country moving towards, let's call it 4G or smartphones in essence. Once you get to a point where almost smartphones could be found at a price of around $500, which could be affordable for people in less fortunate positions, then that's when you really drive digital inclusion, because now they have access to a smartphone and the price of data would have actually come down significantly as well if there is subsidized infrastructure into those areas by government, and therefore you can include a lot more people into these economies that is becoming much more digital as well. I think once people are actually part of those economics that are much more digital, they can really contribute to global knowledge. And you'd see once people learn new, they become innovative, they could launch features, products, and a whole lot of things to the world, not just to South Africa as well. That would really unlock the full potential of our young people as well. That will soon be about a quarter of the world's population. And I think our dividend in Africa is the youth that we have, but we have to look after it. We have to ensure that the ecosystem is created in such a way that they could potentially find themselves participating and becoming economically active, citizens in any society. And I therefore appeal to most organizations, to donors, to tech giants, fellow ICT companies and policymakers as well, to really work together to narrow this digital divide. It's not a single company, it's the entire society that would actually enable this to actually happen in our country and also our own continent as well. And I think there's a couple of things that we can do around affordable devices, right? Open source tools once people have access to the internet. How do we build capacity just in general, right? With all of these new skills, that sort of skills. And how do we create platforms where we connect these kids to people across the world where they really learn new skills as well? I won't really talk too much about spectrum allocation. That's really for government. And I think for me, government subsidies has helped many countries and many economies from growing. And I'm even including first world economies such as Germany and in England, where government became actively involved in really building an infrastructure highway for the country with private partners and being able to do that. And it works and it helps a lot of people as well. We really would like to imagine in Africa in a global community that is not just a part of the global community, but is an actual participant in really creating innovative products and services. We don't want to find ourselves being perpetual consumers of products, but we actually want to be producers of products as well as the continent itself. Let's not allow geography or income levels to really becoming a determined factor in how our people's destinies pan out going into the future. Thank you very much for having me.